In 1847, deep within the humid lowlands of Georgia, there stood a plantation that from a distance appeared orderly, prosperous, and respectable. The house was tall and white, framed by columns that reflected the afternoon sun, surrounded by vast fields of cotton that rippled like a pale sea beneath the southern sky. Visitors saw refinement, discipline, and wealth. They saw a widow who managed her late husband's estate with poise and efficiency. They saw her sons, strong and well-dressed, preparing to inherit a thriving empire of land and labor. What they did not see was the silence that lingered behind closed doors. The calculations written not only in ledgers, but in glances, and the unspoken system that turned human lives into currency. The plantation lady had not always commanded such authority. When her husband died unexpectedly, whispers spread across neighboring estates questioning whether a woman could maintain such an operation. Yet she proved decisive and coldly efficient. Within months, productivity increased. The cotton yields rose. Debts were collected. Overseers who hesitated were replaced. She learned quickly that survival in that world required more than gentility. It required an unwavering commitment to profit. Beneath her composed exterior lived a mind that measured value in output and expansion, not morality. Her sons had been raised in comfort, educated in discipline and obedience. They had grown accustomed to seeing enslaved men and women as part of the landscape of their youth. From childhood, they absorbed lessons about hierarchy and ownership. They were taught that their future depended upon maintaining control. Yet, as they entered adulthood, their mother's influence deepened in ways that would shape the trajectory of the plantation and the lives trapped within it. By 1847, demand for labor in the Deep South had intensified. The internal slave trade expanded as plantations sought to increase production. Buying enslaved people from traders was costly and unpredictable. The plantation lady studied the numbers in her husband's old records and recognized the darker calculation. Birth, she realized, was more profitable than purchase. Children born on the plantation required no auction fees. They could be raised, trained, and eventually sold or worked according to the estate's needs. To her, this was not cruelty but strategy. In the quarters, rumors began to circulate long before anyone dared speak openly. Certain women of childbearing age were relocated closer to the main house under the guise of domestic service. Young men were reassigned in unusual patterns. The changes seemed subtle at first, explained away as routine adjustments. But patterns formed, pregnancies increased, families were rearranged. The overseers enforced silence with an intensity that suggested something deliberate was unfolding. The plantation lady's sons were at the center of this quiet machinery. They were instructed to follow their mother's guidance without question. At first, they may not have understood the full scope of her intentions. They were told that the future of the estate depended on strength and growth. They were reminded of their duty to protect the family legacy. A language of inheritance and responsibility masked the moral reality beneath it. What began as obedience evolved into complicity. Inside the big house, conversations were held in low voices behind locked doors. The plantation lady kept meticulous records. Names were listed, ages calculated, health noted with clinical precision. She studied which pairings might yield strong offspring. To her, it was breeding livestock, an agricultural extension of the cotton rows outside. The human cost was erased in ink. Each new birth was recorded as an asset. Each child represented potential profit. In the quarters, the emotional toll was immeasurable. Women faced pressure and fear, aware that refusal could mean punishment or separation from loved ones. Men carried quiet rage, knowing they were powerless against a system designed to strip them of agency. Children born into this environment entered a world already defined by calculation. The community leaned on faith, song, and whispered solidarity to endure what could not be openly resisted. As months passed, the plantation's apparent prosperity drew admiration from neighboring estates. Few questioned how such rapid expansion occurred. Publicly, the plantation lady maintained an image of propriety and discipline. She attended church, hosted small gatherings, and spoke of stewardship and order. Privately, she refined her system, ensuring secrecy through fear and reward. Overseers who complied were compensated. Those who hesitated were dismissed. The sons began to feel the weight of their involvement in different ways. One embraced the authority it granted him, burying doubt beneath arrogance. The other grew quieter, his gaze lingering too long on the faces of those affected. He had neither openly defied their mother. The power she wielded over them was absolute, reinforced by expectation and inheritance. They were bound not only by blood, but by a shared entanglement in the plantation's darkest secret. By the end of that year, the number of births had altered the plantation's demographic balance. Infants were cradled by mothers whose exhaustion ran deeper than physical labor. The plantation lady viewed each child as evidence of success. The ledger reflected growth. The fields promised expansion. To outside observers, it was a testament to effective management. To those living within the quarters, it was a reminder that even the most intimate aspects of life could be weaponized for profit. The Georgia air remained thick with heat and secrecy. What unfolded on that plantation in 1847 was not an accident of circumstance, but the result of deliberate planning, shaped by greed and sustained by silence. Behind the facade of gentility and order lay a system that treated reproduction as strategy and family bonds as tools. And as the year progressed, the consequences of those choices began to ripple outward, setting the stage for tensions that could not remain buried forever. As 1847 moved deeper into summer, the plantation's outward calm concealed an increasingly rigid structure beneath it. The Georgia heat pressed down upon the cotton fields, heavy and relentless, and with it came a tightening of rules within the quarters. The plantation lady's system was no longer experimental. It was deliberate, refined, and enforced with quiet precision. Movements were monitored more closely. Assignments were adjusted with calculated intent. Women of certain ages were shifted between field labor and domestic work. Their proximity to the main house no coincidence but design. The overseers, once primarily concerned with crop output, now carried additional responsibilities that were never spoken of openly. They tracked cycles, noted absences, and reported in coded language to the mistress of the estate. She demanded details with the same composure she used when discussing cotton prices. Health, age, temperament, physical strength were reduced to data points. The humanity behind those details was irrelevant to her calculations. Every pregnancy was evaluated not as a personal event but as an investment. Within the quarters, awareness sharpened into dread. The enslaved community understood patterns even when no one dared name them aloud. Certain cabins were reassigned. Young women were summoned to the house at unusual hours. The sons of the plantation lady moved through the grounds with a presence that now carried a different meaning. Their authority was no longer limited to supervision. It extended into the most intimate and vulnerable aspects of life. The other women in the quarters became quiet anchors of strength. They whispered warnings, offered comfort, and attempted to shield the younger ones where possible. Songs carried coded reassurance. Prayers grew longer at night. Yet resistance had limits in a place where refusal could mean whipping, sale, or separation from family. The plantation operated on fear as effectively as it did on labor. Inside the big house, the plantation lady maintained an image of unwavering composure. Visitors were received with politeness. Neighbors praised her resilience as a widow managing such a large estate. She spoke of discipline and order, of responsibility to maintain prosperity in uncertain times. No one saw the locked drawer in her study where detailed records were kept, separate from the official ledger. There, in careful handwriting, were notes that reduced human lives to projections of future value. Her sons reacted differently as the months passed. The elder son embraced his role fully. He interpreted his mother's guidance as validation of power. He walked the grounds with confidence that bordered on cruelty, convinced that dominance was synonymous with strength. The younger son grew increasingly withdrawn. He avoided eye contact in the quarters, lingered in the stables longer than necessary, and spoke less at the dinner table. But silence was not defiance. It was survival within a family bound by expectation and control. Births began to increase noticeably by late summer. Infants cried through the humid nights, their mothers exhausted beyond the demands of fieldwork. Each newborn was recorded promptly. The plantation lady inspected them with detached interest, evaluating health and potential. She calculated years until productivity. She calculated possible sale value. She calculated expansion without the expense of purchase. To her, this was efficient management. The emotional toll within the quarters deepened. Fathers struggled with helplessness, unsure how to protect those they loved from a system that extended beyond physical labor into forced intimacy. Mothers carried a double burden of work and fear. The community leaned heavily on shared faith and collective resilience. They told stories of freedom, of distant places where chains did not define existence. Those stories were fragile but necessary. By early autumn, the plantation's profitability drew attention from neighboring estates. Some speculated about her methods, others admired her results without asking questions. In a society where wealth justified silence, curiosity rarely overcame convenience. The plantation lady understood this well. She relied on social norms and the culture of complicity to protect her secret. Tension began to surface in subtle ways. A field hand refused an order and was swiftly punished. A woman fell ill under strain and was accused of weakness. The younger son witnessed more than he wished to see. Doubt flickered across his conscience, but it remained buried beneath fear of his mother's authority and the weight of inheritance. To challenge her would mean dismantling the foundation of their family's power. The plantation had become a closed system of calculation and control. Birth was no longer a private joy or sorrow, but a line item in a strategy of expansion. Family bonds were manipulated to serve profit. The facade of gentility held firm in public view, while behind it a machinery of exploitation operated with chilling efficiency. As 1847 approached its final months, the consequences of these choices began to ripple more visibly, setting the stage for fractures that could not remain hidden forever. By the time winter approached, the plantation no longer felt merely tense. It felt strained, as if something beneath the surface had begun to crack. The cotton harvest had been strong, and the ledger reflected growth that neighboring states quietly envied. Yet prosperity did not erase the atmosphere of unease that settled over the quarters. The increase in births had changed the rhythm of life. Cabins once occupied by small families were now crowded with infants and weary mothers. Sleep was scarce. Work did not lessen, and the knowledge that these children were seen as future assets rather than sons and daughters hung heavily in every whispered conversation. The plantation lady moved through the house with the same measured grace she had always displayed, but her focus sharpened. She reviewed her private records nightly, adjusting plans as though refining a business model. She took note of which women had delivered healthy children and which had suffered complications. She calculated recovery times and future potential. Compassion never entered her reasoning. Efficiency guided every thought. In her mind, she was safeguarding the estate's future in a world where competition was ruthless and survival required decisiveness. Her elder son mirrored her confidence. He spoke openly about expansion, about acquiring neighboring parcels of land, about increasing output without relying on outside traders. He had absorbed his mother's logic completely. The system they had created seemed, to him, proof of ingenuity. He dismissed murmurs from the quarters as inevitable discontent. Authority, he believed, required firmness, not reflection. The younger son, however, found himself increasingly unsettled. He noticed the way conversations stopped when he approached. He saw the exhaustion in the women's faces, the guarded expressions of the men. He heard the cries of infants at night echoing across the yard and felt something shift within him that he could not name aloud. The plantation that had once represented security and legacy now felt suffocating, yet he remained silent. The weight of family expectation and the fear of confronting his mother's will bound him tightly. In the quarters, resilience persisted despite growing strain. Elder women organized quiet support networks, sharing food and tending to the sick when strength failed. Men took on additional burdens to shield mothers from the harshest field assignments when possible. Songs at night carried deeper sorrow, but also deeper unity. The community understood that survival depended not only on endurance, but on solidarity. They could not dismantle the system, but they could preserve fragments of dignity within it. Rumors began to spread beyond the plantation's boundaries. A traveling trader mentioned unusual population growth on the estate. A neighboring planter made an offhand remark about the widow's remarkable efficiency. These comments were delivered with admiration, yet beneath them lay curiosity. The plantation lady responded with composure, attributing success to discipline and careful management. In a society where enslaved people were treated as property, few questioned methods as long as profits remained steady. Tension escalated when one woman, weakened after childbirth, could not return to the fields as quickly as expected. The overseer, under pressure to maintain productivity, responded harshly. The punishment sent a ripple of fear through the quarters. The younger son witnessed the aftermath and felt a surge of guilt he could no longer ignore. For the first time, he confronted the possibility that the system he participated in was not merely harsh, but deeply corrupt. Inside the big house, cracks appeared in subtle exchanges, a delayed response at dinner, a prolonged silence when the plantation lady spoke of future plans. The younger son's hesitation did not go unnoticed. She questioned him with calm intensity, reminding him of duty, of legacy, of the sacrifices required to preserve what their father had built. Her words were persuasive, laced with authority and expectation. She framed their actions as necessity rather than cruelty. Survival, she insisted, demanded strength, yet doubt, once awakened, could not be fully suppressed. The younger son began to spend more time away from the house, lingering near the stables or walking the edges of the fields alone. He avoided direct involvement when possible, though avoidance offered little relief. Every cry of a newborn, every glance from the quarters, reinforced the moral weight pressing against his conscience. By the close of that year, the plantation stood outwardly stronger than ever. The harvest was profitable. The number of enslaved children had increased. Expansion seemed within reach, but beneath that apparent success lay fractures that could not remain hidden indefinitely. Resentment simmered quietly in the quarters. Doubt grew within the big house. The carefully controlled system, built on secrecy and calculation, faced pressures from within that no ledger could measure. The Georgia air turned colder, but the tension did not ease. Instead, it thickened, coiling tightly around every relationship on the estate. What had begun as a calculated strategy now carried consequences that extended beyond profit. Conscience, fear, and quiet resistance were gathering strength, and the plantation lady's carefully constructed order was inching closer to a moment when control alone might no longer be enough. As the new year began, the plantation entered a period of uneasy stillness. Winter in Georgia was milder than in northern states, yet the chill in the air seemed to settle inside the walls of the big house and the cabins alike. Outwardly, operations continued with precision. Cotton was prepared for shipment, repairs were made to fences and storage sheds, and plans for spring planting were discussed over long evenings at the dining table. The plantation lady reviewed figures with unwavering focus, satisfied that her strategy had strengthened the estate's standing. But beneath the orderly routines, pressure was building in ways she could not fully control. In the quarters, exhaustion had deepened into something more dangerous. The women who had endured forced arrangements now carried not only the physical burden of childbirth, but the psychological weight of knowing their bodies had been turned into instruments of profit. Some grew quieter, others clung fiercely to their children, aware that attachment itself was risky in a system where separation was common. The men, bound by fear of retaliation, channeled their anger into silent solidarity. Conversations at night were hushed but intense. They spoke not only of survival but of limits, of how long a community could endure without breaking. The elder women sensed a shift. They had lived long enough to recognize the signs of unrest. Small acts of resistance began to surface in subtle forms. Tools were misplaced more frequently. Work slowed in ways difficult to prove intentional. Messages were carried between cabins with greater urgency. These gestures were cautious, but they marked a collective refusal to accept complete submission. The plantation lady noticed fluctuations in productivity and responded with sharper oversight, unaware that pressure often breeds defiance rather than obedience. Within the big house, the younger son's internal conflict grew more visible. He struggled to maintain composure during discussions of future expansion. When his mother spoke of increased birth rates as evidence of success, he no longer responded with confidence. His silence became heavy. His gaze drifted toward the windows, as though seeking escape beyond the fields. The elder son, loyal and ambitious, dismissed these signs as weakness. He aligned himself even more firmly with their mother, reinforcing her authority and ensuring that the system continued without hesitation. The plantation lady confronted her younger son privately one evening in her study. Candlelight flickered across ledgers and carefully stacked papers. She reminded him that the estate's prosperity ensured their security in a volatile world. She framed their actions as necessary adaptation to economic reality. She spoke of legacy, of family honor, of the consequences of appearing vulnerable in a competitive society. Her voice remained calm, but beneath it was steel. Doubt, she warned, could unravel everything they had built. Yet doubt had already taken root. The younger son had begun observing more closely the human cost of their decisions. He noticed how the mothers avoided eye contact in the house. He saw the guarded tension in the quarters whenever his brother approached. He felt the weight of inherited power pressing against his conscience. The plantation, once a symbol of stability, now felt like a prison of expectation. In the quarters, a moment arrived that intensified the strain. One woman, refusing silently to participate further in the system imposed upon her, withdrew into herself after childbirth. Her health declined rapidly. The overseer's impatience led to harsher enforcement of work schedules, deepening resentment among the community. The elder women shielded her as best they could, rotating responsibilities and risking punishment to protect her strength. The younger son witnessed this quiet unity and felt the contrast between calculated authority and genuine care. Rumors began traveling beyond the estate with greater persistence. A neighboring planter's wife remarked upon the unusual growth of the enslaved population. A visiting trader asked probing questions about labor costs. Though no direct accusations were made, curiosity sharpened. The plantation lady responded with practiced composure, attributing prosperity to discipline and sound management. Social norms shielded her from scrutiny, yet even she sensed that secrecy required constant reinforcement. The balance of control grew fragile, productivity wavered as morale deteriorated. The elder son demanded stricter oversight, urging swift punishment to reassert dominance. The younger son hesitated, recognizing that harsher measures might ignite open resistance. The plantation lady stood between them, determined to maintain authority at any cost. She believed fear remained the strongest tool at her disposal. But fear, when stretched too tightly, can fracture. The quarters felt it. The big house felt it. Conversations became shorter, movements more cautious. Every glance carried meaning. The plantation had evolved into a place where calculation collided with conscience, where silence masked turmoil, and where the strategy that once promised prosperity now threatened instability. By the close of that winter, it was clear that the carefully engineered system could not remain unchanged forever. The plantation lady still held power, but cracks had formed in loyalty and compliance. Resentment simmered in the quarters. Doubt deepened within her own household. The Georgia fields lay quiet under pale skies, yet beneath that stillness, tension coiled tightly, waiting for a moment that would force hidden truths into the open. Spring returned to Georgia with deceptive beauty. The cotton fields began to stir with new growth, soft green pushing through soil that had absorbed years of sweat and silence. From a distance, the plantation looked prosperous and calm, its white house standing tall against the bright sky. Visitors continued to see order. Wagons rolled in and out with shipments. Church bells rang on Sundays. The plantation lady carried herself with the same composed authority that had shielded her from suspicion. Yet, beneath the surface, the estate had reached a breaking point that no amount of discipline could permanently contain. The strain within the quarters had deepened into quiet defiance. It was not loud rebellion, not open confrontation, but a tightening of unity that made control harder to enforce. The community had grown stronger through shared suffering. Mothers who once wept alone now leaned on one another openly. Fathers who had carried silent anger began speaking in careful whispers about escape, about networks rumored to exist beyond Georgia's borders, about distant states where abolitionist voices were growing louder. Whether those rumors were accurate mattered less than the hope they provided. The younger son felt the shift most acutely. He could sense that fear no longer held the same power it once had. The glances he received were no longer purely submissive. They carried awareness. They carried judgment. His conscience, already fragile, began to fracture under the weight of what he had enabled. Sleepless nights became common. The cries of infants echoed differently now, not as distant sounds, but as accusations. He had grown up believing inheritance was a blessing. Now it felt like a stain that could not be washed away. The elder son, determined to preserve authority, pushed for harsher enforcement. He argued that leniency had allowed morale to weaken. He urged their mother to reassert dominance through stricter supervision and visible punishment. To him, control was slipping because it had not been tightened enough. The plantation lady listened carefully, weighing his words. She understood power intimately. She had built her system on precision and secrecy, but she also recognized that instability threatened the very profitability she valued above all else. A turning point came when a planned sale was announced quietly within the quarters. Several children, born under her calculated strategy, were to be sent south to a larger estate offering a high price. To the plantation lady, it was a logical transaction. The children had reached ages where their value could be maximized. The ledger reflected opportunity. To the mothers and fathers, it was devastation. The community reacted not with chaos, but with a stillness so heavy it unsettled even the overseers. That night, the quarters did not sing. Fires burned low. Conversations were hushed but urgent. The younger son walked the grounds in darkness and felt the tension in the air like a coming storm. He overheard fragments of whispered plans, sensed movement where there should have been none. He realized that something irreversible was forming, and for the first time he feared not scandal but violence. Inside the big house, the plantation lady reviewed the sales contracts by lamplight. She saw numbers, not tears. She saw expansion, not fracture. Yet even she could not ignore the unusual quiet settling over the estate, the absence of song, the guarded expressions of the workers, the restless pacing of her younger son, all signal change. She tightened security for the coming days, instructing overseers to remain vigilant. The morning the sale was to occur dawned heavy and grey. Wagons arrived earlier than expected. The children clung to their mothers. Fathers stood rigid, fists clenched at their sides. The overseers moved forward with rehearsed efficiency, but unity, once awakened, is difficult to suppress completely. A refusal occurred, small but powerful. A mother would not release her child. Others stepped closer in solidarity. The confrontation was tense, charged not with shouting but with collective resolve. The younger son intervened, his voice unsteady but firm. He argued for delay, citing unrest and potential disruption to productivity. It was a calculated appeal to the language his mother valued most: profit, stability, risk management. The plantation lady faced him before the assembled workers, her composure unwavering. For a moment, the entire estate seemed suspended in silence. She understood the danger of public weakness, yet she also recognized that forced compliance in that instant could ignite something uncontrollable. After a long pause, she ordered the sale postponed under the pretense of contractual review. The wagons departed empty. The quarters exhaled in cautious relief. No victory was declared, but a boundary had been tested. That postponement did not dismantle the system she had built, but it marked a shift in power dynamics. The younger son had openly challenged her authority, even if indirectly. The community had demonstrated unity strong enough to disrupt her calculations. The elder son saw this as failure. The plantation lady saw it as a warning. Over the following weeks, changes unfolded quietly. The sale contracts were revisited but never fully executed. External scrutiny increased as rumors of unrest circulated. The plantation lady adjusted her strategy, reducing overt transactions that might draw attention. The growth she once celebrated now required caution. By the end of 1847, the plantation stood altered in ways not visible from the road. The fields remained productive. The house still gleamed in the southern sun, but inside its walls and within the quarters, awareness had transformed relationships. Fear no longer operated alone. Conscience had surfaced within the big house. Unity had strengthened within the quarters. The system of calculated control had encountered its limits. The Georgia plantation lady retained power, but it was no longer absolute. Her sons were divided not just by temperament, but by moral awakening. The children born into her strategy grew beneath watchful eyes that understood more than she had anticipated. What began as a secret design for expansion had reshaped the estate in ways that numbers could not measure. The story of that year did not end with open rebellion or public scandal. It ended with tension unresolved, with authority questioned, and with a fragile understanding that even the most carefully engineered systems can falter when confronted by human will. Beneath the bright Georgian sky, the plantation remained standing, but its foundation had shifted, and once a foundation shifts, it is only a matter of time before history forces the rest into the light.